Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points and League of Nations was a defining moment during the post-World War I period to ensure the lasting peace in Europe. Wilson's relentless effort to promote the proposals, however, was faced with strong conflicts from both sides of the Congress. Unfortunately, his deteriorating health during the campaign around the nation undermined the potential compromise of the treaty, which accelerated the path toward the future onslaught of the Second World War. On November 11, 1918, the Allies ended the 4 years of conflict known as the First World War. The Paris Peace Conference, consisting of Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, was held in Versailles, France, in response to post-war negotiations. Despite the conflicting views in the peace conference, President Woodrow Wilson triumphantly returned home with the compromised League of Nations draft on June 28, 1919. His arrival was not well received, but rather marked with conflicting hostility from the Congress against the proposed Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson deeply believed the treaty would bring forth an everlasting peace by reducing conflicts in Europe, as he attested in his speech on September 25, 1919. The nations will enter into a solemn promise to one another. They will never use their power against one another for aggression, that they never will impair the territorial integrity of a neighbor, and that they never will interfere with the political independence. Despite Wilson's struggle of ratification, he faced a conflict from the Senate, which was divided into two opposing views. The irreconcilables, including Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin, William E. Borah of Idaho, and Hiram Johnson of California, epitomized the American traditional foreign policy proposed by George Washington in his farewell address. As stated by H.W. Brands, the author of Woodrow Wilson.
The main thing they did was to look at 120 years of American history and contend that American isolation from Europe's troubles had served the United States well. And they thought that America's participation in the First World War had been a mistake and should not be repeated.
They believed it was unwise to break away from conservative isolation policy by involving or even interfering in European conflicts, as Senator William E. Borah addressed to Wilson on November 19, 1919. "We are in the midst of all the affairs of Europe. We have entangled ourselves with all European concerns. In other words, Mr. President, and this comes to the question which is fundamental with me. We have forfeited and surrendered, once and for all, the great policy of no entangling alliances, upon which the strength of this republic has been founded for 150 years. The reservationists, on the other hand, composed of the majority of the Senate, was headed by Henry Cabot Lodge, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. They perceived the League would severely reduce the power of Congress and cripple the legislative branch. They felt the treaty should be amended in order to maintain their influence on the international platform. Furthermore, due to the party alliance between the Democratic Wilson and Republican Congress, the tensions between the two inevitably increased. Among the conflicts, Article 10 was often considered by the Senate as a tool to limit congressional influence upon the declaration of war, by guaranteeing unconditional support to other members within the League.
The biggest concern that the reservationists had was that the United States would be dragged into wars that had nothing to do with American national security or American national interests. They didn't want the United States to act as the policeman of the world. Supporters of Wilson and the League contended that the United States did need to act as the policeman of the world, because if the United States did not, nobody else would.
Although Wilson endorsed the position of the article, as he stated to the Foreign Relations Committee on August 19, 1919. Article 10 seems to me to constitute the very backbone of the Wild Covenant. Without it, the League would be hardly more than an influential debating society. Senator Lodge strongly insisted on the revision of Article 10. Despite their misgivings, they nonetheless were willing to compromise the articles under the acceptance of the proposed revisions by the Senate. Consequently, the 14 amendments known as Lodge's reservations that were proposed to President Wilson included reserving Congress's authority to declare war as a requirement for the ratification of the conflicting covenant. Wilson, however, regarded these compromises as a national disgrace. As he wrote in the letter to his wife, "Can't you see that I have no moral right to accept any change in a paper I have signed without giving to every other signatory, even the Germans, the right to do the same thing? It is not I that will not accept. It is the nation's honor that is at stake." Wilson's refusal to compromise created the conflicting tensions with the Republican Senate, which resulted in the eventual defeat of the Senate's ratification on March 19, 1920. Even though the conflict within the Senate led to the defeat of the settlement on September 3, 1919, Wilson embarked on a Western speech campaign to advocate the League of Nations to the public.
Wilson understood that the only way that he could change the minds of the senators, who looked like they might vote against the League, was to demonstrate that the American people as a whole were strongly in support of the League. And the only way he could do that was to travel the country.
Unfortunately, shortly after the speech he delivered in Puebla, Colorado on September 25, 1919, he collapsed due to stress and his deteriorating health. The stroke marked the fateful turning point in history, as stated by John Cooper, professor at Princeton University and author of Woodrow Wilson and the Fight for the League of Nations.
The major event is the stroke. I mean, that cut it short, and that changed Wilson. If that hadn't happened, first of all, the tour was working. It was bothering lives. The senators, they kept saying, "Oh no, it has no effect on us," like hell it did. They were. Wilson was drumming up support, and it was clearly bothering his critics. It was strengthening his bargaining hand, and he actually had a second tour planned. After he finished that one, he was going to go up the East Coast to New England. So and this clearly, this would have put him in a strong bargaining position. So that what you have is a bad situation out of that. I mean, Wilson's stroke was just it had all kinds of bad effects.
Wilson's death resulted in the demise of the ratification of the treaty. The conflict between Wilson and the Senate was a crucial moment in both American and world history. The failure to compromise shifted the United States foreign policy from open European intervention in World War I to the traditional isolation policy seen during the 20s and 30s. Furthermore, the United States' absence in the League of Nations accelerated the rise of dictatorial dominance in both Italy and Germany, which eventually led to the Second World War. Despite its failure, however, the League of Nations provided the basis for the establishment of the United Nations after World War II, the organization which played a major role in the future conflict between the United States and China, as seen in the Korean Armistice Agreement signed on July 27, 1953. Wilson's legacy is truly remarkable. His conflict without compromise in the Senate led to revolutionary changes in modern foreign policies in both the United States and around the world.